he stays, who's he in charge of? A great number of his MPs don't like him. They made it obvious. And the country's already said in the local elections, you're gone.
I'm host Michael Allen with Beacon Global Strategies. Today I'm joined by Dr. Alan Mendoza, the Chief Advisor for Global Affairs at Nigel Farage's Reform Party. Today we'll discuss the British political firestorm engulfing Prime Minister Keir Starmer, the Iran war, the state of the special relationship between the United States and the UK, and the apparent appeal of the Reform Party. Stay with us as we speak with Dr. Alan Mendoza. Alan Mendoza, thank you so much for joining NatSec Matters.
A great pleasure to be here, Mike.
Well, we're happy to have you. I've gotten to know you through the years, especially as you've associated with the Reagan Forum in Washington, D.C., and you have had such a storied and interesting career already. And we're going to get into your move from the Conservative Party over to Nigel Farage's party and the work you're doing for him on foreign policy. But since we first invited you, we've had the Iran war and consternation in Europe about that and the British role in the world. And now Starmer is fighting for his political life. So this is the best moment to have you. And I can't wait to get into these issues because they're incredibly exciting. So here we are. We're on the other side of a successful visit from the king to the United States, where he had all the right moves, said all the right things, pleased everyone. And here we are, I hope, about to get to a better place with our relationship with the United Kingdom. But Starmer is fighting for his political life, and I'm not so sure he was on board with many things the United States wanted to do anyway. So first tell us, when did Starmer begin to spiral? Was it, and please explain the controversies around Epstein, or was it before that?
Well, it's a very complicated one because here you have, on the surface, an extraordinary situation. You have a Prime Minister who won an extraordinarily large majority in the general election not even 2 years ago, where Labour turfed out the Conservatives after 14 years. And, they didn't just win, they won by a landslide. But the problem, Mike, was that the landslide was a very it's almost impossible to have a narrow landslide, but it was, because basically the way our system works, Labour won a third of the popular vote, but won 2/3 of the seats. So it meant that it was a mile wide and an inch thick, to use the phrasing. And so he started from a position which looked very strong, i.e. I've got a massive government majority, but in reality, people had not necessarily given a massive vote of confidence to his government. And then very quickly it went wrong from day one, because there were no real animating ideas to his government. There was no sort of sense of philosophy, no underlying belief or programme that was sort of being enacted. And as a result, because of that, and just to highlight that point, the two most successful governments in Britain over the last 50 years were Margaret Thatcher's and Tony Blair's. I don't have to agree with what they did, but in terms of changing Britain and getting things done. And the reason I would posit they managed that was because both of them had an underlying ideology. Thatcher had Thatcherism, Blair had what was called the Third Way, and they then were able to bolt on a whole programme for government around that, basically. Well, Starmer didn't have any overriding philosophy. Nobody knew what he was about, what he was for. Labour spent the whole election with what was called a Ming vase strategy. Just carry the vase across the room, hoping it doesn't smash. Don't say too much because it might smash or someone might knock it off, and all the rest of it. So, you didn't have that to start with. And then events started to quickly cascade and lead him into very difficult terrain. We had the Southport riots. We had the various U-turns on winter fuel for pensioners. Other matters that he tried to get through, his backbenchers didn't like. He had to come back. And so very quickly, what was a position of strength became a position of weakness. Blown off course, buffeted by global events and domestic events. And things took, a much worse turn more recently with the whole Peter Mandelson episode, the links to Epstein, and the suggestion that Mendoza had never been appointed as ambassador, and in fact he was only appointed because Starmer just wanted him for that job, and there was no proper checking and vetting. It just seemed to, I think, sort of solidify in everyone's mind that this was not a government that was doing things properly. It was a government that was doing things accidentally, and as a result, it was seeping support. Add to that, it was obvious if you look around, crime is rife, demography is a disaster. People are worried about growing, the influence of radical Islam. Migration, illegal migrants, that problem not solved. And then, of course, national defence looking very weak in the context of what we've seen in Iran and beyond. So if you put all these things together, as well as an economy that wasn't in top gear, and people began to, already with the turn of the year go, how long can this government last? And then to just put a seal on it, you had local election results last week, which were disaster for the Labour Party. They were absolutely smashed in the polls, losing around 1,400 seats, I think it was, in terms of the number of seats they lost. And Reform UK winning comprehensively, but Labour were leaking seats everywhere, to Reform, to the Greens, even to the Conservatives in certain places, Lib Dems, in Scotland to the SNP, Plaid Cymru. They were being roundly defeated across
everywhere. Wow.
And when you get to that point, people are going, what is all this about?
Yeah.
Where are we at? Who is this guy leading us? Where's he leading us to? And if I was a Labour MP, I'd obviously conclude he's leading us to disaster. And that has set itself up for this situation now where it looks like he's going to be challenged. I stress looks like because it's another complicated process to get to this end point. But clearly his authority is shot, and nobody can believe that he will lead that party into the next general election.
Okay, so we'll get to the events soon on Starmer's speech earlier that is trying to save him, and then people that might challenge him next. But, I consider myself an ally of Britain. I love our history. And
a fine ally you are.
Exactly, and I'm excited about the special relationship. And I loved King Charles's line that we just can't rest on our history, though. We need to have an agenda going forward. And I get that Donald Trump isn't exactly one to coordinate and consult before major actions. But I have to say, when I saw the Prime Minister addressing an audience on a Muslim holiday, him seeming to stress to everyone there, hey, don't punish me. We had nothing to do with this. Suggesting, I don't know, it was almost as if he was afraid that he was going to get heckled, and he was trying to inoculate himself. It didn't seem strong. It came across to me over here, and by the way, the clip went everywhere, wow, who is this guy? He's got no direction. But do I have that right? How was that seen across the pond?
Are you referring to his comments around the Iran war? Are you referring to that?
Oh, yeah, sorry.
Okay.
Yeah.
So his line on Iran has been, I made the right call. I, said Britain should not be involved, and, that's what I've delivered. Well, it's not true. So let's look at his claim here. Britain's not involved. Britain has been involved. Britain wasn't involved over the first weekend because, rather disgracefully, he said to the Americans, you can't use the bases in the UK because we don't want to be part of this conflict. Now, it's really interesting, that whole stance, because if you go back to 1986, Margaret Thatcher was faced with a similar question about the bombing of Tripoli, if you remember. And she was asked by the Reagan administration, can we use the bases, please? We want to use our bases. And her line was unequivocal. It was like, look, I don't want to take part in this. I'm not interested in taking part in this attack on Tripoli. But it would be churlish and foolish for us to say to an ally that has had its bases here for 40 years at that point in time, had kept us safe and was keeping us safe from the Soviet Union, and say to them, no, we're okay with you doing that, but we're not okay with you doing other military things that you felt were in your national interest. Thatcher got it right, Starmer got it wrong. Nobody felt Britain should be part of the Iran war. It wasn't the case. But he then, of course, did allow them to use the bases after the first weekend. And he also said that Britain would participate in so-called defensive operations, which included what seemed to me to be offensive strikes on places that might be targeting, Britain's allies in the Gulf. So, it's a lie that we weren't involved. We've been involved. We just weren't involved at the start. And as a result, the damage was done. We damaged the relationship with no purpose, since we got involved later anyway. We damaged special relationship. We damaged the relationship with our Gulf allies. I think the relationship with Israel is already at a very low ebb because of what this government's done separately on Israel. And I think it is all linked to domestic politics. You're right to make a link with domestic politics. What is quite clear is that the Prime Minister is trying to appease a sectarian voter base in the form of parts, at least, of the British Muslim community who are motivated to vote primarily on foreign policy rather than on domestic policy. And this, by the way, came out in the recent local elections. We've had about 1 in 10 of the successfully elected candidates across the country have been people who we'd call sectarian-style candidates. They are either people who are themselves Muslim and making a particular pitch to a particular segment of the Muslim community, or they're people who are not Muslim, like, for example, members of the Green Party, which did very well in the local elections, who are also making a very specific dog whistle pitch, or frankly, not even dog whistle pitch, an open pitch, to a segment of the population rather than the general population. And so this sectarianism issue is rife and alive, I'm afraid, Mike, in our politics today, and it's causing difficulties because people like the Prime Minister are having to, or feel, I don't think they do need to, but they feel they need to bow to it. And as a result, that is impacting on our foreign policy, it's impacting on policies at home, and it's impacting on our effectiveness as an ally as a result of it.
Well, that's what I was referring to with the holiday event that Starmer spoke at. He definitely seemed like he was tried to appeal to that particular part of the labor base without reference to the special relationship or Britain's obligations abroad. Are there so many places to take this conversation? Let me first ask you, I agree, you all have interests in the Middle East. Let's get to the Gulf allies in a second, but I feel like I read that you all had some inkling that we were going to do this, yet there were no British ships even in the Mediterranean or even anywhere poised to get there in a timely fashion. As I read the newspapers, it seemed like you all had some obligations to help Cyprus, I think it was. And so talk a little bit about, did they just fumble their situational awareness, or was this a fault of the United States for not coordinating?
Well, so again, I'm sure the US did not keep the UK fully apprised of what was happening and what its plans were. That said, we were told certain things. That much is evident. We know that because we did move some air forces into position in February into the Gulf, so there was clearly some knowledge of some kind of activity was going to happen. Mm-hmm. And not simply that, we must have surely factored there would have been, potential Iranian attacks on bases that we had in places, because that's just how the Iranians operate. So I think there were two problems here. I think there was a failure of strategic view here about what the Iranians might do, and therefore there was a sense of, do we really need to defend these bases, or how do we mitigate any potential risk, which didn't carry through. And I think the second issue was that, of course, this war has brutally exposed Britain's weakened military state. Because, of course, famously or infamously, one of the reasons that we did not have a destroyer, say, parked outside Cyprus. The Cyprus issue, by the way, is that we have sovereign bases in Cyprus. Mm-hmm. These are British territory within Cyprus that house military camps. So you would think we'd want to protect those. Obviously, the purpose of a destroyer is to do air defence from the perspective of missiles coming in or drones coming in, shooting them down. But it seems that, as we discovered, it was very difficult for us to move a ship there because we didn't seem to have any that could do it. Either they were all being refitted or they were in other places, and you couldn't therefore prepare to move the right force. And then, of course, when the ship, the HMS Dragon, got there, very soon it had to be withdrawn because there was a water problem with it. So again, lots of question marks about the readiness, the ability of the UK to scramble forces at fairly short notice, or to plan appropriately and effectively for something that that we might have suspected was on the way. So I think lots of failings were exposed by that episode, and none of them cast Britain and British leadership in a good light.
I'm going to come back around to immigration and the Muslim cohort in British society when we begin to talk about the Reform Party. But let's just finish off Iran here. It seems that the United Kingdom and France are becoming more interested in helping on the Strait of Hormuz. Maybe not getting in the middle of an escort operation, if indeed we return to that soon, which is something that the United States is going to consider. We also might consider the use of force, as you know, and we have a blockade going currently. So we have these three things floating out there. But tell me a little bit about how these consultations have gone among the Europeans. Would they be interested in getting involved in helping with the security of the Straits after hostilities are over? Where is everyone? And do I have it right that Europe seems to be a little bit more open to helping?
Well, Europe is open to helping on this aspect because, of course, the reopening of the Strait is vital for European energy security going forward. Not because we buy our oil from there necessarily, but because of the impact on the global market for oil. And so, as well as other commodities, of course. We know the other commodities that have been affected by this blockade and by the Strait being closed as well. So quite clearly, it's an advantage to Europe to have the Strait open so that supply chains can continue and move on, and there isn't a feral competition for resources, which obviously ends up in ultimately prices going up. And therefore, we are willing, I think, to put skin in the game when it comes to making sure that those routes are kept open. But I think the caveat's going to be only once hostilities are over, only once this is concluded. And of course, it needs to conclude in a certain way. I mean, the Europeans are, to be fair, resolute about the idea that Iran should not be charging tolls here either. I mean, the European position is we want to get back to a status quo ante of the Strait. Everyone can ship stuff through, including Iran, no cost. We're just moving things on in that sort of way. I think any deviancy from that is going to, kind of cause problems for the Europeans, whether that is an American-imposed deviancy or whether it is an Iranian deviancy. But the point is, it is clearly in Europe's interest to have a free trade Strait of Hormuz.
Great. Before we begin to shift the focus of our conversation, if you could just give us your analysis of the state of transatlantic relations. We, I think, effectively, bluntly got Europe to go to 2.5% military spending, 5% if you count infrastructure. I think people were chagrined at first at how blunt the president was, but then admitted later they probably needed to be, they needed him to shake them to do that. And then the narrative goes, the president got on this kick about Greenland and really angered all of the allies. And there have been a series of other things in the trade realm that have also angered our European partners. So the narrative here is that we have horrible relations with Europe, certainly within the continent, and that's because of the way Donald Trump has been handling things. What comment on that? How do you see it from your post?
Well, I do think that the state of the relationship is in a very bad place. That's quite clear. And there are many reasons for that. What you've suggested is certainly one of them. I think there has been a sort of lack of interest necessarily in what European allies might think of various American démarches in various areas, and that is not good. I think the Greenland thing was particularly destructive to that, mainly because, of course, Greenland is currently part of a NATO member, and it seems therefore very strange to be acting in that sort of way to a fellow NATO member, and that has obviously made people question whether that alliance is real and will continue going forwards. But of course, you start off with the interesting point, which is that the Europeans had for many years been essentially riding on American coattails when it came to the security of their own continent. It's been American money that's funded European security, and the Europeans have wasted their money on welfare bills as opposed to on defence. The world has gotten very scary very quickly now, and the Europeans have realised that, but they still need a lot of kind of cajoling to move into a position where they are now prepared to spend more on defence, although there still will need, I think, to be more than what has currently been committed. But I think everyone would give America a pass on that one. I think everyone would go, yeah, you know what, you were right. You were right on that. And you were right to force us along in that way. But it's the other bits, I think, that are difficult. The other bits, the mood music has not been helpful from the White House. There's just been, a sense that really, Europe doesn't matter to the US, which I think is I get it on the one hand, because people look at Europe's force disposition and capability and go, well, it can't really help us very much, therefore what is the point of it? But on a secondary approach, look, who realistically is going to stand with the US on the international stage when it comes to kind of facing down some of these malefactors? It's going to be Europe. It's not going to be Africa. It's not going to be Asia. It's realistically going to be Europe. Still, even despite the enfeebled state of the Europeans. So isn't it better to, by all means, berate the Europeans for the poor state of their military capabilities and preparedness, but get them to change it, get them to turn into useful allies again? And certainly, I believe that we are useful allies and can still be useful allies, and that actually it's always been American leadership that has helped bring Europe to the right place where it needed to be, whether that was in the Cold War or beyond, in that, or even before, you could argue, in that way. And so we do remain, in my view, better together than apart, and that a sort of plague on all your houses approach does neither Europe nor America a good turn, given the challenges we are going to be facing for the rest of this century are going to ultimately affect both of us, and both of us will lose out from not standing together. So yeah. I think there's work to be done on repairing that relationship on both sides, and reminding ourselves this is the indisputable partnership that we need to ensure prosperity.
Well, I think that's a terrific thing that you've just advanced. More Americans need to hear that. Probably more Republicans like me need to hear that despite worries about what's going on with China, that we still do have a lot of interests in Europe, and coordination on everything from trade to security issues is, I think, preferable to us going on alone. One area where Britain has been a leader, I think, is they've leaned forward on Ukraine. And so, briefly touch on that and talk about our common security threat being Russia.
Well, it is. I mean, here's the truth. Russia remains a big problem. It's an aggressor state. It's an aggressive state. It's has shown its kind of willingness to cross international borders, try and seize land. It attacks civilians. It will not be satisfied with anything it wins in the Ukraine war. It will want more than that. And so it is essentially both against our values, but also against our strategic interests, because it makes no sense to allow Russia to carve off bits of Europe, because, again, that is a challenge to the US, frankly, and to the American order, and to the American, sort of place in the world. All this, you talk about, make America great again. Yes, great. I'm all in favour of that. But America's pretty great already, in the sense of what it's managed to achieve internationally, and the sort of successes it's seen over the last 80 years, in its diplomacy and beyond. So it seems, why would America want to throw that away? Yeah. And I think the Europeans have done a good service to show America, look, you can take a bit of a back seat here. We've got it. We're putting force in. We're doing things. We recognise we're on the front line. You're a bit further back. But don't just abandon us here, because we're actually fighting the same fight.
Right.
And ultimately, when you're looking at the bigger picture, and I do think it's fair to say the Americans look at much broader horizons than the Europeans. We have lost our ability to strategically think globally because of our diminished circumstances. There's no doubt about that. Americans see, I'm always struck when I go to Washington or I'm in rooms with Americans, the horizons are much broader, and quite rightly so, because you retain that global power status on the highest level. That means you can and will think about the global picture in a way Europeans do in a very piecemeal fashion instead.
Great.
But if you think about that, our working in Ukraine on the front line gives you more capacity in China and beyond, or the Middle East, to do the things that you want to do there. Yeah. So again, that's a partnership approach. And the answer is not to leave and abandon the Europeans and say, no, we're out of here. But go, yeah, we're going to give you the lead on this. We're going to back you up. But we need you to back us up in other places in response as well. Yeah. And I think that... Ultimately, why do relationships work, Mike? They work because of utility. You can have lots of shared values and shared beliefs, but they work because on a practical level they work. Otherwise, you're just friends who see each other every now and again and go, oh, it was lovely seeing X. I'll wait another 2 years before I see them again.
Right.
What makes you want to see X more is that, yeah, you like their company, you share views with them, but they also probably bring something to the table with them as well. So if we're bringing something more to the table on a place like you, and you're bringing more to the table in other places, that seems to me the kind of recipe that's going to renew the alliance going forward.
Well said. We need to make sure that message gets around. We're going to take a quick break, and we'll be right back with more of our discussion with Dr. Alan Mendoza.
Beacon Global Strategies is the premier national security advisory firm. Beacon works side by side with leading companies to help them understand national security policy, geopolitical risk, global technology policy, and federal procurement trends. Beacon's insight gives business leaders the decision advantage. Founded in 2013, Beacon develops and supports the execution of bespoke strategies to mitigate business risk, drive growth, and navigate a complex geopolitical environment. With a bipartisan team and decades of experience, Beacon provides a global perspective to help clients tackle their toughest challenges.
Okay, so the original reason I invited you to the podcast before all these exciting events began to happen in Great Britain was your own personal history here. You, of course, co-founder of the Henry Jackson Society and leading foreign policy mind in London. But tell us about the state of the Conservative Party, of which you were an active member, and that you've now gone to the Reform Party. And talk to us a little bit about your own evolution, and how does that match how weak the Conservative Party has become? I used to watch Prime Minister's Questions, so I used to see and study what was going on over there. I don't feel the Conservative Party at all over here in the United States. I used to always feel like they were active and visiting. But what is going on with politics, at least between the Conservatives and Reform, over there in the UK?
Well, it's another long story, but the short form of it for our podcast audience is that the Conservatives were in power for an awfully long time, 14 years, between 2010 and 2024. And particularly in the last period of that long stint, I think most people recognise, including the Conservative leadership today, that the party failed to deliver on its principles, and not only failed to deliver on its principles, actively acted against its principles, seemingly. To give you some examples, the Conservative Party was always supposedly a low-tax party. When it left office, British taxation was at the highest level since the Second World War. It was supposedly a party of low state spending. Well, spending had ballooned through the COVID and Ukraine war period, and again, there was no sign of it coming down. It was a party of national defence, but we've seen how military means have been, emaciated over time, and we have seen the decline of British military capabilities, and that occurred, of course, during that 14-year period. Not only then, it's a longer story, but it was not revived during that period and continued its downward spiral. And I think probably the most important issue that's driven people has been the migration one. This party that was supposedly about, sort of British values and, Britishness, presided over not simply a crisis of illegal migration with boats arriving on a daily basis, conveying, illegal migrants onto our shores, but also a massive legal migration change, which is working its way through society. And there was a 2-year period when a net 1.5 million people entered the UK. Okay, that's a net 1.5 million. More entered, but more departed. So that's a huge population churn for a country of 68 million to have that level of change over. And people felt that demography was changing, the country was changing around them, and the Conservatives, supposedly a party of conserving, were instead the agents of radical change. And that is not why people voted for them, and that's not why people were Conservatives. And so, I felt that the party had lost its way horribly. And so therefore, I didn't have confidence in it anymore. And I didn't think it was going to be able to recover so simply either. But then, of course, there was a question mark about what do you do about that? Do you just slink off into the sunset, or do you do something else? And it so transpired that the rise of the Reform Party coincided with this period of change. And, in conversations with the leading figures in Reform, it struck me that they had the right set of beliefs for how to recover the country and to take it out of this sense of absolute crisis. I should of course add, part of the crisis was also this absolute rise of extremism that we've seen in the UK. Weekly hate marches, the incredible upsurge of anti-Semitism as well. All those things that again very un-British in their ways. So I felt that we needed a total transformation of the way we were acting, and that a minor shift was not going to do it anymore. Britain has gone so far down a certain sort of plug hole that we need a totally radical movement in the model of 1979, I think, to shake us out of the torpor that's making us a sick man of Europe and back into a sense of who we are as a country, what we want to achieve as a nation, and where the optimism lies in politics. And I felt, speaking to Nigel Farage in particular, that he had that mix. He had the right ideas for the country. He wanted to effect that dramatic change and was crucially prepared to take some of the measures necessary that would actually act against these problems the Conservatives in part had left us with. So for me, it was that choice. It was, look, this party has failed. There was a new set of people on the horizon who can do things. I believe they can achieve those things. And you could go, well, I'll sit back and let it happen. And, Jordan, or you can say, I'm going to put my shoulder to the grindstone. I'm going to help create a new reality for that party. And so that's what I thought I would do. And so far, I have to say, I feel very vindicated in my decision, because I think the British people have shown they're interested in the project Reform has started. And I will hasten to add, it's a project. This is not a fully formed final entity right now. It is still developing policy. It is still building out its team. But how incredible to be part of a movement that is genuinely energising people across the country, not simply to come out and vote, but to also be part of it. It's a very swift-growing political party. It went from 2 members to 270,000 in a very short period of time. It's the largest political party in Britain today, we believe, and it is growing all the time. And of course, it had this remarkable success in the local elections last week. So, of course, the challenge is on Reform to keep on showing that it can deliver a policy platform that people will want and that people will vote for. But, we're in a good place, I think, to start doing that and delivering further.
Excellent. Okay, so let's go through 2 of these elements that you outlined. First, can we do a little deeper on migration? I want to understand, and I've read this in every journal or newspaper article, but it's especially pronounced on the right here in the United States, that Britain might feel like strangers in their own country now. And you mentioned the hate marches, you mentioned some of the anti-Semitism that has arisen. We've had these issues here, elsewhere in Europe, and I think it feeds a sense of populism. But people are quick to say, well, that's, people are being nativist or, racist or anything. Talk a little bit about how this has affected British society. Is it just the conservative types who've been worried about it? I mean, how has it materially affected the country? Well,
so this is, of course, the big question. firstly, people notice things are going wrong. Now, you go to swathes of Britain and you'll notice nothing that's changed for the last, 100, 200, 300 years. Rural places, will be the same as they were essentially, with broadband, techie stuff. Mm-hmm. But apart from that, it's not going to be a transformation. But if you go to the big cities, that's where you're seeing the change, basically. Go to parts of London, lots of Birmingham, bits of Manchester, you're going to see, and lots of other small towns, in the Midlands and the North, and you'll see the effect of mass migration and how it's transformed those places. Now, migration in itself, is potentially neutral. There's no sort of negativity necessarily around that point. But what we're talking about is migration with integration. That's the key. The truth is, Mike, that if you go to a good number of places in Britain today, in some of the cities, and you get off a train and walk around, you may discover that you're actually in the trappings of modern day Britain, but with the dress and the mores of Pakistan and Bangladesh. Because integration has clearly failed in some of these places, and the dominant culture, as Ed Hussein wrote in his very good book, which I'd recommend, Among the Mosques, dominant culture
which one is
not Among the Mosques, it's called. Mm-hmm. The dominant culture is not the British culture. It is a culture that's been imported from the old country. Now, the interesting thing is, of course, America is a country of migration. But historically, how it's always worked in America is you come in and you shed your old skin and you become an American. You become an ex-American, this American, that American, but you're an American. That's the whole point.
No.
Here, it used to be the case that, of course, migrant communities came in and they did that. They became part of Britain. We've seen many successful, migrant communities from the Huguenots onwards who became part of the warp and woof of British life. But something went wrong in the last 30 years, and that something that went wrong was probably the collapse in belief in ourselves, the belief that our system and values were worth pushing to other people arriving in the country. And I blame, of course, Tony Blair for this, because his doctrine of multiculturalism essentially said, no, cultures seem to be equal, and as a result, it is not our place to enforce the culture of Britain upon new arrivals. Well, if you don't do that, you can't necessarily blame the new arrivals for going, well, okay, thank you very much, I'll keep my old customs. I won't integrate into Britain. I will not, in fact, I kind of start to argue that maybe the people around me should conform to me. Maybe it's my value system that others should conform to. And many people are saying, oh, you're absolutely right. Your view is as important as ours in this regard, and there is no national perspective. You start to understand perhaps why this change has occurred and why there has been a massive problem. Then, of course, you have a separate issue here, which is the religious element. And, of course, the rise of radical Islam is something you haven't had to contend with in quite the same way in America, but is very rife across Europe. It is, of course, a version of Islam that it will argue is scripturally authentic, because it can point to Quranic verses or hadiths to back up its sayings. And, it has become quite an aggressive and muscular movement within British Muslim communities. And I should stress the Muslim communities are very diverse here, as you would expect. They're divided between Shia and Sunni, they're divided between schools of jurisprudence, they're divided between people who, are Muslim because they happen to be born Muslim and don't keep anything, to very religious conservative types. But at that extreme end of the market, and it's much bigger than people think, you have a huge problem. Because those versions of radical Islam very much believe that Britain should conform to radical Islam and Sharia law, and that actually enclaves and beyond should become essentially self-governing. And once they start with politically transforming neighbourhoods and areas, it becomes very difficult to put them back. And, that's a challenge that's going on. People have noticed, of course, it is happening. They're trying to, there's a backlash to it. But when you also have politicians playing to it because of the rising numbers of people who might be affected, you can see why it's a perfect storm for a social cohesion crisis, because you're not getting a united view on things.
Great. That's very helpful. So let's go squarely to Nigel Farage. You outlined some of maybe the conservative aspects that he was going to pick up. But tell us, let's start with foreign policy, national security. Where is Nigel Farage on all of these important issues?
Well, he is very much in the British mainstream. Here's someone who's a British patriot who wants to put forward British viewpoints on the key issues and things that are in the national interest of this country. He is, but people at various times have tried to portray him as either some kind of Putin's lapdog, or sort of slavishly following Trump, and neither is true. On the Russia-Ukraine conflict, he's very firmly in the mainstream when it comes to understanding it was Russian aggression that caused the conflict, that Russia are the bad guys, that the war has to end in a favourable way for Ukraine. And he's not been afraid in recent months to dispute some of the things even the Americans have been trying to do. For example, the peace plan that was put forward, he did not think that was a good plan for Ukraine. And therefore, thought should not happen. He thinks that NATO jets should shoot down Russian planes if they enter NATO territory. This doesn't sound to me like a lapdog for Putin. And equally on the Trump thing, a lot's been made of the personal relationship. Of course they have a personal relationship. But the idea that any British political leader or future prime minister is going to do the bidding of the American president just like that is for the birds. That's not how British political leaders operate. He came out against the Greenland idea, said that was not a good idea. He was critical when the president, I think mistakenly, claimed that nobody had helped the US during the Afghanistan war, etc., in that sort of way, forgetting, of course, the sacrifice that British troops had made in that. So you have someone who I think understands the international picture, who said quite clearly as well he would have given the bases over on day one to the US and said you can use them. And I think that's what you want. You want a candid ally, basically, somebody who is not a pushover, who's not gonna not stand up for what their country believes in, but when push comes to shove, you'll know they'll be on the right side of the debate and line. Yeah. And that's the kind of prime minister he would make, I think, on the foreign stage as well.
So that's good to hear. Talk a little bit also about just rebuilding British defenses and munitions and the defense industrial base. We have all these problems here as well. Is he seized of this issue, or it's not really his thing?
Well, no, of course he's seized of the issue because the first priority of any government is national defence before anything else that you do. Yeah. National defence is obviously a very broad subject, but part of it involves making sure you have the military force and capability to defend your country, whether that is at home or abroad. And so there's a great realization, of course, that we have under-equipped, we have underinvested, our procurement is terrible in terms of the approach. The industrial military base has been driven down and out. And so there's a sense we have to get back some capabilities that we've lost. There's a sense, obviously, that industrially we have to redevelop. And I think everyone gets that defence investment is a really good form of investment, because not only does it drive growth and jobs, but it also, of course, provides the security elements as well. Plus, there's also an export angle. If you get it right, your kit gets bought by other people. So there's a tremendous value in getting defence investment and industrial capacity up to speed on that. And again, the next question people always ask is, well, okay, you recognise that, where's the money going to come from? Well, there's only one place the money can come from. It's by slashing welfare. There is no alternative but to doing that. And the way you slash welfare, he's been quite clear, is not, to sort of take a side across the board and go, we're just, going to turn this into the early 20th century again. That doesn't work. But it is about making sure that people who should not be getting benefits, i.e., illegal immigrants, and even, frankly, people who've legally migrated here but are not contributing, do not get benefits anymore. Because why are we paying for other people, essentially, to live here? It makes no sense at all. That money is much better spent on retooling our national defence and getting to that purpose of actually defending ourselves. So I think that there are obvious ways that you can get to that level that you need of defence expenditure without very tricky questions being asked.
How should Americans see him? I mean, here we would say, does he have nice neo-isolationist tendencies? I mean, he sure believes in a stronger Britain, but does he see Britain in its traditional role as an expeditionary force, a leader, someone who is getting in the mix of issues across the globe? Or is he more, listen, we have our own problems at home. I want to rebuild the military because it's in a pathetic state, but, we're not getting involved in all these adventures?
I'm going to say he believes in both those things. I'll tell you why. And it sounds like a cop-out, but it isn't. Why was Britain able to involve itself globally? Because it had the capacity to do so. at no point did Britain overextend itself in the sense of going, right, we will contribute to this conflict or that conflict, and we didn't have the force to back it up. We did the things we needed to do with the forces we had at our disposal. And it was interesting that as Britain's own strategic horizons increased over the centuries, it of course had a commensurate increase, particularly, of course, in the Navy, which was the fundamental way that you policed and spread your interest in that time period. So we matched capacity to those things. Right now, he's rightly been pointing out that Britain does not have the capacity to do much of that at the moment. So his answer to that is not, oh no, we're little Englanders, we're not going to do anything. It's like, no, we have to be, the cloth must be cut to match what we have, but get more cloth. Let's build design a brand new suit that's going to transform what we do. So it seems to me that he's very much in the mainstream of British tradition when it comes to being outward looking. It is not a British tradition to be inward looking. That's never been the case. But crucially, Britain has always been able to match its interests with its ability to actually project its own capabilities globally. Mm-hmm. That, I'm afraid, is lacking right now. So the worst thing you can do is turn up and shout loudly and carry a small stick. That's by far the worst thing you can do. It's better that we should build up our forces and then get back into a position where we can effectively be part of that global conversation in a way that inspires confidence rather than suspicion from allies.
Okay, well, unfortunately, we're beginning to run out of time. Let me ask you two more here, and then I want to close with your political handicapping, or at least explanation to us of which leader is going to emerge for Labour and when elections are, et cetera, et cetera. But real quick, I hear you, he's not a lapdog to Putin on Ukraine, but does he, if it were up to him and you had the capacity, does he want to keep arming Ukraine? Does he fundamentally believe that Russia's a threat to NATO and that Ukraine is the best thing that those of us in the West have going for us because they're the ones that are holding the Russians at bay?
Well, I think everyone understands from this perspective that if you allow Putin to win the war in Ukraine, you have firstly conceded a very important principle, which is that aggression should not be rewarded. Well, it will be rewarded, and that he will set his sights on his next target as a result of that. And the reality of the Ukraine war is that we are able to fight Russia from a distance, rather than allowing Russia to come closer to our front line. And we're only able to do that, of course, because of the bravery and immense tenacity of the Ukrainian people, who have done the impossible, basically. They've stopped this juggernaut in its tracks and inflicted huge pain on it, and will continue to be able to do so, it seems, for as long as we are able to help them in return. So it seems to me a very, very cheap price to pay for the goal of ensuring that Putin is as far away from our borders as possible. And I detect no change in any sort of positioning from Reform High Command on that basis. It seems an obvious point. Are we all in favour of peace? Of course. Who wouldn't want that war to end? But it has to end in a way that is going to reward Ukraine rather than Russia. There has to be a path that clearly shows Ukraine has emerged in a better position. I think that's the key element here. So nobody wants a war to end, to go on and on and on. It serves no purpose, particularly for the Ukrainians who are being bled every year on this basis and are putting off essential life changes because of it. Yeah. But we can't, of course, walk away and allow Putin to win. So I think there's a very, obvious place to be looking at for how we should be, going forwards there.
Okay, so let's wind up with this. So Keir Starmer appears to be on the ropes. I'd love to hear your prediction of how this is going to end. You mentioned that they won something of a landslide 2 years ago. What does that mean for the next elections? What in the world are the Conservatives doing? And what do the polls show? Is Nigel? What is? You won't have, I know you can't commit Nigel Farage to anything, but
of course,
what does everyone think?
I do not speak for him, that's
exactly,
for sure. Yeah.
That's right. So, but, just be a political commentator for a second. He's expected to run. Is he doing well in the polls? Where are you? Where is everyone over there?
If there was an election tomorrow, the polls are showing Reform UK leading by about 10 points in the polls. That is obviously a very healthy margin. It is unclear whether it will deliver a victory in terms of absolute number of seats, because our politics have become hugely fragmented now. There are 5, 6, maybe 7 political parties or entities that can win seats now in the general election. It's extraordinary. That's very unusual for Britain. It's as if you had, 7 or 8 Ross Perot's, and Michael Bloomberg's deciding to throw their hats into the ring, all simultaneously, all capable of winning a few states in the presidential election. It would be absolute chaos, of course, but that's what our politics is looking like in that way. So that lead may not necessarily translate to a total victory. We hope it would, of course. But the real fact is we're not going to have a general election tomorrow. That's the truth of the matter. The government does not have to hold a general election till 2029. And it can change as many prime ministers as it wants to and still stay in power, as long as it can command a majority in the House of Commons, which it will be able to do. So that, and we saw that because the Conservatives kept on chopping and changing their leaders, if you remember. And they did not need to call a general election until right at the end. Didn't help them ultimately. All those leadership changes did nothing but to increase their misery. But that's a reality. And that's what's going to come to this point here. I'm almost certain that whatever happens in Labour, and honestly, any outcome could emerge here from Starmer staying on for a bit and there being no challenge, it just fizzles out, to Starmer being, resigning tomorrow, and there is a whole drawn-out contest. But in a sense, it doesn't matter because the damage has already been done. The government has lost its authority. If he stays, who's he in charge of? A great number of his MPs don't like him. They made it obvious, and the country's already said in the local elections, you're gone. Who takes over? Well, in a sense, it doesn't matter. Because, again, whoever is taking over a damaged ship. It is, and they're not going to be able to suddenly put it right, because it seems to me that none of them have a view necessarily about what you would require to actually, in mid-term, as it were, transform this government into a different place. And so I think Labour's path is, inexorably going to be downward, because that is just the way these things work. Once you start trying to put the lifeboats out, you never get them coming back again. The ship won't be rescued, it's going to go down. And that then, of course, does lead to the question, what happens in the next election? And, of course, we're some way off, as I said. Right now, Reform would seemingly do very, very well and would probably win those elections. But again, whether they get enough to win a majority, I don't know. The Conservatives are in a very bad state. All this talk people are saying here, the party's reviving. Not in terms of results, it isn't. It lost another, nearly 600 seats in the local elections this year.
Wow.
That was on top of a massive loss the previous year as well. However well the Conservative Party might be doing in bits of the media does not seemingly translate into actual votes on the ground.
Yeah.
So then your question is, do you end up with a majority Reform government, or is there a need for a coalition between the Conservatives and Reform? And lots of people are talking about, we must unite the right and all the rest of it. It's way too early for all that talk. Both parties need to get on and do their own thing, allow the electorate to decide what the electorate wants, and then I think we'll get to some possible outcome. The one thing that, of course, most people on the right would be very averse to would be allowing a left-wing coalition to come to power because the right failed to get their act together or failed to work out who was the top dog in that sort of way. So there is, of course, a chance in the next election you could end up with a hybrid Labour, Lib Dem, Green coalition of sorts, and that could win. I'm speculating wildly here because, frankly, Mike, the situation is totally wild. But, the best point, every political party is going to keep on working to its own agenda to try and convince the country it is the right party to lead the country. Reform has a whip hand right now. In a sense, it's ours to lose. And in order not to lose it, we have to obviously show that we have the policies, the personalities, and the understanding of how to deliver everything in government that's going to convince the most number of people in the country to vote for us, because that is the best effective way to deliver that radical change that I mentioned a few minutes ago.
Alan, that was tremendous. We just covered a lot of ground, and I know our audience is going to be thrilled, and I just can't help but think that will be part one of a longer conversation. We're going to have you back. There's so many other things. We'll have you back again. Thank you so much for joining NatSec Matters.
Great to be with you.
That was Dr. Alan Mendoza. I'm Michael Allen. Please join us next week for another episode of NatSec Matters.
NatSec Matters is produced by Steve Dorsey with assistance from Ashley Berry. NatSec Matters is a production of Beacon Global Strategies.